From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
G'day, good evening, especially to those that aren't regular viewers. This is an opinion show. Stand by for it. It'll be rather strong for some, but right on the money for most. Thank you to Chris Kenny. An excellent insight into those many years, many egos, many twists and many turns. Another episode again tomorrow night here on Sky News. I think, like many, I've got a bit of PTSD going back and looking at some of those characters and looking at the very obvious wrong twists and turns. But it's a fascinating look, and we'll talk about it a bit more later in the hour. But as I say, this is an opinion show, chiefly mine, so a few things I need to tell you about. Cost of living, of course, number one issue in the country. Every poll, every time has told us this, month in and month out. And Australians have had enough. Today we saw some new polling that came via the Resolve Political Monitor that says 46% of people think their personal financial situation gets worse in the next month. 50% say it gets worse in the next 3 months, 47% in the next 6 months, and 41% in the next year. So we are right now in the middle of the crunch. We are in the crunch right now where people are already suffering, but people think that it will get worse in the next little while. Interestingly, when it comes to things like interest rates, another one of these questions worth having a look at here is, in the past year, we've seen many goods and services increased. Do you expect your situation, again, to be one that's going to be getting better or worse? Does your income keep up with inflation? Well then, 60% of people telling the left-leaning media organisation that no, their money is not worth what it used to be and everything is costing more. Now, of course, there is no passenger in this. There are active participants, that being the Reserve Bank, and we know that they have delivered a dozen interest rate rises since Anthony Albanese and his treasurer, Jim Chalmers, unaffectionately referred to on this program as Grim Jim, came to power. But when it was just one before the last federal election, the sky was falling in. Well, when it's fallen in another 12 times, at what point does he have to take some responsibility? Well, another poll tells us that the mood is starting to move here, where 35% of people believe that when it comes to inflation, Jim Chalmers is the person who has greatest responsibility to deal with it. 30% of people say that both the Reserve Bank and the government are the people responsible. But if this government thought that what they might be able to do to the new Reserve Bank governor is what they did to the old Reserve Bank governor, which is to blame them constantly for inflation and interest rate rises, it's not going to work. Now, for some magical reason, it seemingly was able to work in the first part and the first half of the Albanese term. It won't be able to work in the second half. All expectations are that you're not going to start to see real wages starting to increase until maybe the first half of next year, but most likely we're dealing with all of this all the way till this time next year. And that seems to be the best case scenario. Politically, the government would hope that that changes sooner rather than later. But when asked by Australians about what the government can do to try to pull back on inflation, well, one of the key things they say is that the government should stop spending money. And while this government does have a surplus, thanks to the Future Fund and the resources sector, 42% of people say that Jim Chalmers should either slash spending or raise taxes to take the pressure off the Reserve Bank, something that 42% of people agree with when it comes to slashing spending. Just 18% of people, probably Teal voters, are the ones who say raise taxes. Both 19, neither 16 and 5% are unsure. But all of it is now starting to have an obvious effect on the overall success of the government. Now, again, after what you've just seen and what you'll see again tomorrow night, whether the Liberal Party is fit for purpose to be returned to office is not really the question. It's whether this government deserves the same majority it currently does for another 3 years. Now, all data, all expectations, all history suggests that we don't dump governments after just one term, no matter how chaotic they can be. Even if Malcolm Turnbull was able to lose 14 seats in his double disillusion 8-week election campaign that he knocked off at lunchtime each and every day, the reality is that Australians will try to give people a chance to be able to either turn a country around or to see out its agenda. But interestingly, one area where the Liberal Party is now starting to regain strength, despite the fact that the former Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, who was in that interview, is of course no longer in the Parliament, thanks to the good people who decided to replace him with super lefty Teal. Well, on economic management, according to the latest Resolve poll, which again published in the Channel 9 papers that you will see in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, that now the Liberals are trusted by 34% of the country when it comes to the issues of economic management. They dipped down, but they're starting to come back. The Labor Party has peaked and is now starting to fall at just 27%. That's why the government does everything it can to change the subject from the economy, and I'll get to an example of that right now. In question time today, we had to wait more than an hour for somebody to bowl up a question that the Prime Minister didn't want to answer and did his best not to answer. And it relates to something I've been talking about for months on this show, which is that when the government has a surplus of $20 billion, they could spend $3 billion of that cutting your petrol taxes for the next 6 months by 25 cents. Obviously, double those numbers, either in 50 cents for 6 months or, of course, 25 cents for 12 months, and they've still got plenty of money left over to say, we've got a surplus, keep voting for us. Well, Dai Lee was the one who took up this fight directly to the Prime Minister, of course, the independent member for Fowler, somebody who I think will be one of many Labor heartland seats that may well end up going independent before they go anywhere else, because they talk about what their constituents truly care about, including this question from Dai Lee to the Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, families are paying over $2 per litre at the pump today, which is increasing costs and inflation across the supply chain. It's one of the reasons interest rates has increased, which is hurting working Australians immensely. Fuel prices will go up and down, but a cut to fuel excise would lower costs and reduce inflation now. Why won't the government reduce the fuel excise at a time it has a budget surplus and provide instant cost of living and mortgage relief to families, especially in Western Sydney?
Perfect. Excellent. One of the reasons why this is the right thing to do is that it's not like cutting a cheque for $500 and sending it out to everyone, meaning they've got extra money they didn't already have. This is about making sure that the blood that runs through the veins of our supply chain could be ever so slightly cheaper. It's more than $2 in many parts of the country. And remember, Anthony Albanese thought it was an outrage when it was $1.80. Now, yes, the price of fuel is something that's affected by international events. The tax that the federal government makes off it, and remember, the higher the price, the more the cost per litre, meaning the 40% of your fuel that goes on tax, well, all of it ends up with extra revenue for the government. But this can be foregone because they have the budget surplus. They'll most likely have another budget surplus next year. Now, if it was a Liberal who asked the question, the Prime Minister changes the subject, doesn't want to answer it. He'll never get asked that question by his own side, and the media, for whatever reason, perhaps because we talk about it on this show as frequently as we do not want to raise this as a legitimate, easy thing that must be done by the government to give relief to everyone, from truckies to tradies, from mums, the unemployed, and anyone who uses their car to get around, which is, of course, basically all Australians. Well, the Prime Minister had to kind of answer the question, but listen to the gobbledygook when he knows it's a good idea, but has to come up with a bad excuse why he shouldn't do the right thing.
When it comes to the issue of petrol indexation, one of the concerns that is there in the economy, and including from the Reserve Bank, that feeds into interest rates, is how much cash there is in the economy as well. So we have purposefully targeted cost of living relief.
Now remember, the policy that I'm suggesting, the one that Dai Lee asked the Prime Minister about, does not put extra money into the economy. It just means you have the same amount of money that you got either from your boss, from working from them, from yourself because you have your own business, or from the government because of welfare, but just a small amount that slowly but surely builds up over time means that you have greater capacity to pay the bill that is petrol. It's nothing the government can't afford. It's just something the government doesn't want to do because it wasn't their idea, and they want to bank the biggest surplus possible, not to pay off debt, but to be able to get away with the increasing in spending, which the government's very own intergenerational report promises to go forever upwards for the next 40 years, while the deficits get worse every year for the next 40 years. Well, Dai Lee, of course, realising that the Prime Minister was not answering the question, and the very specific question about a 25 cent a litre drop for at least 6 months. That's the obvious option here. Well, she stood back up on her feet to try to ask the Prime Minister to answer her specific question.
Measures to...
The Prime Minister will pause. There's far too much noise. The member for Fowler on a point of...
So she's ready to ask the question again, put the pressure back on the Prime Minister, but then look what each way elbow does.
The Prime Minister's concluded his answer.
He just doesn't have to keep answering the question. So the question that the media won't report on, the Prime Minister gives a gobbledy-nothing answer, so it doesn't look like a mistake, a gaffe, something that question time would become about. And rather than answering the specific question after he's changed the subject and put out his own world of misinformation that would fail his own censoring of the internet test, which you notice has now been delayed until next year, he simply doesn't answer the question. My suggestion to the crossbench tomorrow is to keep asking the question. My suggestion to the opposition tomorrow is to keep asking the question. Because at some point, the people who are set and paid to report on politics full time will actually have to notice that it's a good idea, one they can afford, but for some reason the pig-headedness of the Prime Minister means they just won't do. Meantime, as for the overall issues when it comes to the economy right now, the problems of inflation, and remember, petrol is part of the basket of goods that the ABS look at to work out whether inflation is rising month after month after month or quarter after quarter. And remember, while the overall inflation rate for the country is about 5 and a bit percent, petrol is close to 20%. Therefore, a reduction in its overall price would, help inflation. You get my point here. But the Reserve Bank has, among other things, said today that expect the ride when it comes to dealing with inflation to be, and I quote, a bumpy one. Meantime, there's also been, according to the OECD, a sharp drop in Australia's economic competitiveness. In ranking the most 20 resilient economies, Australia fell to 20th place. We were in first place in 2004. We're now at 20th, according to the analysis done by the Institute of Public Affairs. Now, when it's the Australia Institute or the Grattan Institute, the left-leaning ones, well, that is taken as fact. When it's the Institute of Public Affairs, most of the establishment tries to reject it. But the reality is the same, from first to 20th under this government's watch. Australia's dropped further than comparable countries, including the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand in the same period, and plummeted 15 places on economic competitiveness from 21st to 52nd in terms of the quality of energy infrastructure. Now, meantime, of course, the Prime Minister is briefly back in the country because he spends so much time overseas. An Airbus elbow is a little tag that is sending the lefties crazy, which is why we're going to keep doing it. Some analysis has come via the Adelaide Advertiser that the amount of kilometres travelled by the Prime Minister since he took over from Scott Morrison is now enough to fly to the moon. Analysis by the Advertiser shows that on return from the APEC visit, he will have travelled 385,586 kilometres. Further, that's more than the 384,400 kilometres it takes to fly from the Earth to the moon. Meantime, that Airbus elbow thing, it really does annoy the lefty media. The people that want to run the protection racket, the ones who want to say nothing to see here when it comes to transparency, the ones that want to say nothing to see here when it comes to the Australian dollar being down substantially on where it was before this government took to office, the people who want to say nothing to see here when it comes to real wages and nothing to see here when it comes to the spending of the government, let alone the 35% of the federal budget that is now spent on welfare, the highest of all time. Well, they're coming to the defence of the Prime Minister. That, of course, the Prime Minister should be travelling, and he should be travelling to do his bit, as Australia is a middle power. But after I've just told you that the Australian Prime Minister in less than 2 years has flown the equivalent of Earth to the moon, you can write as many pieces as you want in the Sydney Morning Herald, and they can be from the former BBC guy or the great Liberal hater in the press gallery, but the reality is people can see this for what it is, which is a Prime Minister who is distracted. Whether they want to admit it or not, he was distracted by spending $450 million on a referendum that we knew months in advance was going to tank. He's spending hundreds of millions of dollars when it comes to foreign aid, which are all about pushing back on China, but we all know China's going to have more money in the long term. And again, otherwise friendly parts of the media that have often run cover for the Prime Minister can't hide on the issue of cost of living. In fact, in news.com.au today, they decided to write that Anthony Albanese returns to Canberra amid brewing political tensions. And it's not just about whether the left wing of the Labor Party is going to get its way about Palestine versus Israel. And of all people, Jackie Lambie said on Monday that Australians are growing increasingly desperate over unaffordable cost of living, arguing that the Labor government has lost its footing. Quote, "These guys in charge of the country, they say they would make it better, and quite frankly, we're not seeing it at all. Completely lost the plot." Look, she'll vote for most of the increases in spending, and she doesn't suggest many things to cut in spending, but still, at least someone is saying something inside the parliament that the rest of the media generally pay attention to, because when she's not saying things like this, she's often bashing conservative side of politics. But welcome to the world of albonomics. Welcome to the reality here that you pay more while the government looks better, and you're supposed to say, "Thank you, Prime Minister." Daily Mail today. It's not easy under Albanese. How Albo's time as Prime Minister has lived up to the opposition's election taunt. Let me just read directly from what they wrote today. Since Mr Albanese's government was elected in May 2022, Australians have suffered from high inflation, with the cost of essential commodities such as gas, power, groceries surging. That has also caused wages to fall in real terms. Inflation is running hot as the national population grows at the fastest pace since the 1950s due to the high immigration. More than 400,000 people moved into the country in the year to August. Meanwhile, Australians are battling a housing shortage and have the world's highest mortgage stress and debt levels. The Reserve Bank, just last week, of course, lifted for the 13th time in 18 months, driving up the cost of mortgages. I'm glad to see what we've been saying since day one was true then, is true now. This was the central promise of Labor in opposition. No ifs, no buts, no asterisks, no footnotes. The promise was direct. A Labor government will lower the cost of living. Instead, for most people, it hasn't been easy under Albanese. Some of the people that are in charge of our communities are now starting to slowly, very slowly, wake up to the threats that are among us. And that is not immigration. That is not people who believe in a different God than you or no God at all, but the people who seek to intimidate people because of whom they are. Today in Canberra, there were people who were claiming to be marching for the innocent citizens of Palestine, and for obvious reasons. We all sympathise with what is happening on the Gaza Strip. Remember, as I told you last night, the average age of people there is just 19. The hospitals are slowly but surely shutting down. The reporters that are inside Gaza have lost members of their family in airstrikes that are, of course, the Israeli government response to the horrors of October the 7th. But have a look at what Adam Bandt had to say today. Now, while Adam Bandt was unable to find it in his heart to condemn Hamas for what they did on October the 7th, joined by many Teals who agree with him, of course, the word Hamas is nowhere there. It's like Israel just decided on October 8 to magically start throwing rockets into Gaza.
Labor continues to back the invasion and then say they're concerned about how many people are dying as a result of it. Well, no. Labor needs to be clear, join France, join most of the rest of the world and call for a ceasefire now. Otherwise, thousands more people are going to die.
Did he call for Hamas to release the hostages? Did he call for Hamas to stop sending rockets into Israel? And just because the Iron Dome stops them does not mean that the rockets aren't being fired with the intent of hitting a target. Now, this issue is, of course, way more complicated than the people who want you to say one side this, one side that. But the Greens are no one's friend on this. Instead, they are riding a wave that we have shown you around the world that claims to be about civilians, but often is about trying to displace the West. Remember, we showed you that last night in New York. No denouncing of the things that happened in Caulfield, of the intimidation of Jews in the suburb of Caulfield that has almost half the population as Jews, who on Friday night were committing the sin of praying to their God. Instead, pro-Hamas people decided to head down there under the veil of talking about the innocent citizens, of course, with an aim to intimidate. Exactly what happened again in Sydney, as the New South Wales police themselves gave a police escort from the Muslim-dominated areas of southwestern Sydney into the Jewish areas of eastern Sydney. They didn't stop them in the city. They didn't stop them at Hyde Park. In a simple message that now the Jewish community receives daily, which is if we can do this while they're watching, imagine what we can do when they're not. Meantime, about the protests which have been happening weekly, particularly in Sydney. Now, all of this, of course, is different than what happened out the front of the Opera House in the days after October the 7th, but still there are elements inside those protests which are despicable. People who still hold up the signs that the best place for the Jews is to put them in the bin. The organisers never talk about this whatsoever. And the bill for this is now running at the best part of about $1 million to police it. Well, I'm pleased to say that tonight, in a preview of what will be in the Daily Telegraph tomorrow, the New South Wales Premier, Chris Minns, is now looking at changing parts of the Crimes Act to be able to start to go after some of the hatred involved in some of these protests. An urgent review of laws that outlaw threatening or inciting violence based on race or religion will be undertaken by the New South Wales Government following the heated protests, saying that something has to change, is Premier Chris Minns. Minns says that the Section 93Z of the Crimes Act, which criminalises threats to incitement of violence over religious or racial groups, while it exists, it hasn't actually resulted in a successful prosecution since it was introduced in 2018. So there's a law on the books that's either not being policed or it's got some holes in it. Time to clear them up. Meantime, the person who I've called for since October the 7th to actually start to talk about the reality of the Australian security forces being deployed against the hate preachers that we have the video of time after time after time, community centre after community centre, that these people need to be pulled into line. They need to be told that ASIO is watching. They need to be told that if they have any capacity to be deported from the country, they will be deported from the country. But today, again, first question time since the hate preacher issue became prominent in the past couple of weeks. The Home Affairs Minister, Claire O'Neill, remember, she is the minister responsible for the AFP, for the Border Force and for ASIO. She wasn't even asked about this. I don't know why by the opposition. So I was expecting she'd get a soft one from her own group. No. Instead, she was up on her feet, not talking about hate preachers, but instead cyber security and using it as a way of blaming Peter Dutton for the immigration system.
We saw awful examples of sexual abuse, and all of this was facilitated by a broken migration system that was broken by the Leader of the Opposition.
And, of course, we had robo-debt yet again. Despite the fact that there was the Royal Commission into the scheme that was already shut down, already paid for and already compensated, of course, Bill Shorten saw today as the opportunity to say that all but one of the recommendations would formally be adopted by the government, something he's signalled at many, many more times. But, of course, question time was not to be about an answer from the Prime Minister to Di Lee about petrol prices. Instead, another get Dutton.
The Leader of the Opposition so far has given no sign of fully owning the disaster which was robo-debt. We all know the difference between a standard politician's apology, if you are offended, I'm sorry, and a real one. So it's time, Member for Dixon, it's time for a real apology today in the Parliament, right here, right now.
Now, of course, one of the reasons why we absolutely had to have a Royal Commission into a scheme that had already been shut down and already compensated for was because the victims of that system, who were absolutely the victims of that system. It was a disgraceful system, it was wrong, and they have every right to feel aggrieved. Absolutely. But this government said that we had to have a Royal Commission so we could hear from those victims. But this is the same government that refuses to have anything like a proper inquiry into COVID-19 to allow the victims whose family members died alone to be able to be heard. Instead, none of it will look at the state governments. Some of it will tinker on the edges of lockdown, but it's already a stacked deck. Two of the three people involved in this are already pro-lockdown. One of them used to work for the Labor Party, and her Twitter history is hardly middle-of-the-road stuff about what they thought were the failures of the then federal government. It's not going to be an inquiry into the failures of the states and our basic humanity that meant people died alone. Instead, it'll be another get Morrison, get Dutton, get Liberals thing, because they believe that that is the ultimate path to being re-elected. They think they're going to be able to copy the playbook of the Democrats in the United States. which is despite the fact that it is getting worse for yourself, don't vote for the other guy because then it'll get really, really worse and our democracy will be at threat. Now, at a time when we have wars in the Middle East, not to mention conflicts around the world, not to mention the problems that we have here in Australia, there is a very significant number of people who want to punish people for the sins of the past and believe that there is an original sin that needs to be constantly dealt with. This is part of the more aggressive part of the Invasion Day marches. Well, there is another word that I think that we need to somehow deploy in this country, and it is the word of forgiveness. Now, forgiveness means you have to say sorry, means you have to acknowledge what you did wrong, but the person who was wrong to some degree has to have forgiveness in their heart so we can all move on. The inability to find a way to forgive each other means nothing ever changes and everything eventually ends up being a blood feud. I mention this because Danny Abdullah is a beautiful man who, of course, lost many of his children, I should say, in the suburb of Oatlands in Sydney's northwest. You'd remember this story. You remember our unsuccessful campaigns to get the people who run the Oatlands golf course to build a memorial on the side of one of their holes. But Danny's a man who believes in forgiveness. His wife, the day after the tragedy, forgave the man who was responsible for the death of her children. You can think of nothing more personal than that. And the Abdullahs have put together a foundation that every February has an I Forgive Day. They are strong on forgiveness. That there is freedom, they say, in forgiveness. 1st of February, every year, the chance to harness the power of forgiveness. And on their website, I want a lot of people who either bear the grudges of the past, and I understand why, to open their hearts to the concept of forgiveness. The greatest miracle is that there's forgiveness for all that's wrong with us. There's forgiveness from all we've failed to live up to because of our inadequacies. There's forgiveness from our wounds, from all that have left us physically, emotionally, spiritually limping and cold. There's forgiveness from injustice, from the unfairness we suffer ourselves, and from the hurt which we inflict knowingly or unknowingly on others. This is really important, so I want to continue. Our lives, to a greater or lesser extent, all end up incomplete, broken, unfairly ripped away from us, and causing hurt to others because of our weakness, infidelities, sin and malice, and still it can all wash clean again. There's a new life after all the ways we've gone wrong in this world. And that comes through forgiveness. There's nothing more healing or more miraculous than a moment of reconciliation, a moment of forgiveness. Our hearts that are frozen and dead from disappointment, bitterness, anger, separation, and hatred can beat again. Forgiveness is the most astonishing miracle we will ever see or experience this side of eternity. It alone makes for the possibility of peace in our world. Danny's back in the news today because he went to jail and looked the man who took his children's lives in the eye. And he saw into the soul of the man that weaker men like myself would hate for the rest of our lives. But he does not.
Forgiveness is like a muscle. You need to keep building it. And for me, like my wife and I, our goal was to minimise the impact on our kids that are currently alive, the grief that we've experienced. And it's only through the road of forgiveness, which is the narrow road, that it can minimise their impact.
I love that man. I love his message. And it's something that all of us, when we are carrying our grudges, should think about. The power of forgiveness. We'll debate that and a whole lot more in a moment or two's time here on Paul Murray Live. Big night ahead here on the show that always calls it like we see it. We're going to have Holly Hughes, Nicholas Rees, James Morrow and a whole lot more. Wait till I tell you some people who are planning not to forgive and they're the primary school kids of our country. This is bizarre. More in a second. How's this for a chat? Debate for the rest of the show. None other than the wonderful James Morrow, National Affairs Editor for the Daily Telegraph, host on Sky News. Congrats on the numbers, of course, for Outsiders. Yesterday, mega as always. The wonderful Holly Hughes, who's sitting there resplendent and excited that she's nowhere near the Greens, but she is still technically in the building right now in Canberra. And Nicholas Rees, that Mo grows by the moment. Support him at Movember.com, of course, the Deputy Lord Mayor of Melbourne. Guys, there is about to be, a couple of weeks' time, a school strike for Palestine. The same people that were school striking for climate, but then for some reason have never done one since the federal election, where the Greens got what they wanted, despite the fact that the climate is getting worse, of course, and the summer of bushfires that are on their way. And now the nucleus of the same idea is going to see school students across Melbourne and potentially across the country leave school on a day to support the children of Palestine. Now, James, again, the reality of Gaza is that, as I've said before, the average age of it is 19. There is horrific suffering of children, as there was, of course, the targeting of children for rape and murder by Hamas. But let's deal with this here when the left wants to use the school kids of this country as the way to bludgeon the wider population. You know what? On climate, it was about their future. This is just showing that they're brainwashed by the Greens.
Well, it actually is about their future, but not in the way I think that they realise. In fact, it's actually much more tangentially about their future than anything to do with, oh, we're going to strike and, we're going to do this for the climate or whatever, which is a bunch of nonsense. This here actually really is, Paul, about the future of the West and the sort of society they grow up in. I would invite them, if they really wanted to show their solidarity with Palestine, maybe the girls don't get an education at their schools. They don't go to school at all. Maybe, the gay kids don't get treated to wear purple days anymore. Maybe it's a little bit more sinister. I think these kids need an education in what exactly they are standing up for. And I'm sorry, I know I can hear Nicholas behind me going, oh, no, it's all about peace and love and Hmong means nonsense. This is about kids being used to support Hamas, a prescribed terror organization. These kids in a better world would be out marching for Israel, showing their solidarity and saying, Hamas, release those hostages.
Nicholas, you tisk, but surely you agree that the school strike for Palestine is hardly being informed on a true understanding of history or geopolitics. Instead, it's just about reacting to TikTok.
Well, look, I think what's going on in Israel and Gaza is diabolically complicated, and I think the whole situation is of course, terribly, terribly sad. It's a tragedy. I don't know if I don't. And look, I also encourage the children of Australia to be engaged in current affairs. I think it's good for children to grow up being active and engaged in what's happening in the world around them. But look, I don't know that taking days off school and missing classes is good for the kids or good for Australia either. I think that I don't want to see Australia divided. I don't want wars happening overseas dividing us as Australians, and I think that is increasingly happening at the moment.
Well, also, well said. Thank you. Good to hear. Holly, again, New South Wales is now starting to talk about maybe trying to beef up the parts of the legislation that say when you try to intimidate somebody about religion, about race, that this could be a potential area of prosecution. Some laws existed since 2018, but duck eggs, zero. No one's ever been successfully prosecuted.
Well, the kids in Victoria who want to take a day off school to protest, they'll all have their placards out there from the river to the sea. Now, the first thing is they don't understand what that means. That is the complete annihilation of Israel. But I think if you asked most of those kids what river and what sea, they couldn't name it. Mm-hmm. And it's just absolutely abhorrent that they have been so terribly brainwashed in this chant that we have seen from the river to the sea. And I can tell you there are Green senators in this building with posters up in their Senate office windows from the river to the sea. It is disgusting, absolutely and utterly appalling. And if we want to talk about a ceasefire, let me tell you when there was a ceasefire. October the 6th. There was a ceasefire then, and this has all been created by Hamas. We want to talk about the education that they receive in Gaza. by the UN, these kids are taught to hate Jews and Israelis in such a way that it is absolutely appalling. I've made a couple of speeches reading out from UN-based textbooks and how they must spill their blood and things that, you know, committing jihad is a requirement for the homeland. This is what kids in Gaza are taught. So if we want to listen to everyone saying, oh, poor Palestinians, poor Gaza, we're not dealing with a group of people who are like, we want a two-state solution, we want to be friends with Israel, we want to make this work. They are being taught generation after generation that it is their duty to annihilate Israel, to get rid of the Jews, and that hatred is palpable. And until you remove Hamas, until you remove that hate teaching, this is going to go on for generation after generation after generation. And to your point, Paul, girls won't get an education because they don't get an education at all. Another speech that I've given was about a Palestinian man who escaped from the West Bank because he was gay, and he was actually found just outside Tel Aviv by his family, taken back to Ramallah and believed beheaded for being gay. I bet all of these kids say they're all out there for LGBTIQ plus communities. Well, go and talk to Hamas and see how they treat those communities. Go and talk to them in Gaza and see how they treat those communities. They might not be quite out there so pro-Palestinian anymore.
Now, we, of course, have been told by Nasty Nikki Sever, the self-admitted liar, check her own comments, that you can't possibly talk about immigration and the speed of it, the increase of it, the pressure on housing stock, infrastructure and all the rest of it. But guess who is? Her former boss, Peter Costello, the boss of the Nine TV, radio and online empire. He says that extremely high immigration is driving up rents and inflation. Why is he wrong, Nicholas?
Well, 500,000 is a very high number, no doubting that. It, you know, used to be around 150 to 200,000. But of course, what's happening now is a bit of catch-up after years of Australia having its borders closed, and we've got an economy which has been suffering acute labour shortages. I mean, all your viewers would know that. You still can't get tradesmen to help with housing construction and other important things going on in the economy. And so the people who are coming in at the moment, largely international
kids
students,
do arts degrees and they don't know how to be
part of our economy. Backpackers as well, people coming here on a working holiday, that's good for the country. And so I wouldn't want to see 500,000 people coming next year and the year after, but as a sort of one-off catch-up after years of border closures, as long as it's well managed, carefully, prudently, then I think it's okay.
Well, aren't we getting to 900,000 and the expectation is on our way to 1.5 million once you throw in your family reunions, all the rest of it?
It's a lot more than that, Paul. The 500,000 is more like 650, 750 this year. And also, they've changed the provisions to make it a lot easier for students and other people to, once they come here, just stay forever. And there's no provision made for housing these people. It's simple economics, and yet you have all of these people in the big Australia lobby who deny and deny and deny that this is part of the reason. And the IMF said the population surge, their words, not mine, is contributing to the fact that our standards of living are dropping 5.1%, more than I think any other developed country. And yet, you know, it's all just, oh, hey, let's have a big YIMBY, you know, building fest. We can knock down all the neighborhoods and put up, you know, crummy, stack them and rack them apartment blocks. And that's what Australia's going to be to satisfy the big business and university and all these dodgy training colleges that are really getting rich on this while everybody else has to suffer with more crowded roads, more expensive housing, more crowded schools, more crowded hospitals. I'm sorry, I'm pro-immigration. I'm a migrant myself, but my God, you cannot just have this open border situation, which is where, Nicholas, I'm afraid we really are.
Well, don't forget, we're in a scenario where, and of course, you know, the beginning of the climate refugee stuff that's going to start off with a couple of hundred in Tuvalu, but we know that's now going to be added to a whole collection of other things. Holly, I want to talk about some reporting from our friend and colleague Andrew Clennell on these airwaves this afternoon, where he says that an attempt to get some information about what the department was telling the Transport Minister about the decision to block Qatar Airways from being able to land more flights in Australia and thus dropping the cost of overseas travel, but the minister is now blocking it. But I thought this was the government of transparency.
That has got to be the biggest joke in the world. I mean, this is a government who consistently blocks down every attempt at any transparency whatsoever. I mean, Qatar's one, they've knocked back any examination and audit into Aboriginal land councils. We've just had 6 days on the sea dumping bill because it was going to be supported by both the Coalition and Labor. But what we said to them was to get the vote on early when they came to us was, well, we want the inquiry that we've requested into transmission lines, and they preferred to have this bill in a committee stage rather than going to a vote, rather than give the Coalition inquiry into this Rewiring the Nation transmission program. This government is not about transparency. They're about doing deals for their big union mates and their corporate mates behind closed doors. And I think everyone knows this was a bit of a wink and a nod and a handshake between Mr Albanese and Alan Joyce. Don't worry, mate, I've got your back. We'll protect Qantas and not let Qatar in. Oh, Nicholas, don't you sigh at me. It is so obvious that that is what's happened. And, you know, didn't that go well? We had the Voice campaign with the big Qantas plane and the yes stickers. That was a winner. You know, it's just appalling.
Nicholas, that was the...
I actually agree. The document should be released. Okay,
defend.
So look, I do agree. The document should be released. We have a right to know what went into this decision because it's confounding, right? We're all still struggling to understand why those 24 extra flights weren't allowed so that we could get a better deal.
The assistant treasurer said that.
But then, you know, the good senator just went on a crazy frolic there, lobbing in so many conspiracy theories. She really just discredited what she was trying to say, and there was a sensible kernel of truth there, which was, yes, the document should be released.
See, this is the misinformation stuff they're going to try to police.
This is why Mr Joyce won't seem to come back to Australia.
All right.
They have to shut down the inquiry so he didn't
including
appear.
the very Labor senators who were more than willing to make political hay out of his corporate carcass, but they're no, don't worry, you don't have to come back. We've all moved on.
Tony Sheldon supporting Alan Joyce. It was gorgeous.
Quick break, back with more. Now, a $1 billion problem that I guarantee you are going to be affected by tomorrow. We'll talk about it next. Now, normally I wouldn't bore you with British politics, but there's been a weird couple of hours that have taken place in London. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has been sacked for being, frankly, too right-wing, and the lefty Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron, who of course set up and then lost the Brexit referendum, has returned to not just the Parliament, he'll get a spot in the House of Lords, but he's also going to be their version of the Foreign Minister. Now, all of this, of course, is played out on live TV and has this incredible moment when the former Prime Minister returns to Downing Street to get the job nobody saw coming.
I should say. I'm not quite sure who this might be. If somebody's sacked, then, of course, they don't come up Downing Street. That's done in private. That's the security detail just opening the door for... David Cameron? What? Wait. I was not expecting that.
Okay.
Live TV can be fun, and it's always interesting that literally you heard that wonderful pause, and we've all had those moments on television, James, where he just is... Yeah, that is who I think it is. The former Prime Minister, the one who, of course, lost Brexit, brought back into the heart of government now.
Look, I just think that that was funny, but nothing else about this is funny. I mean, Suella Braverman, spoke truth here. She called out those Hamas rallies as hate marches. She said the Met Police were doing a biased job in the way they were enforcing the law. For that, she got the sack. It's a bad day for Britain.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, Nicholas, but I don't know whether, especially when, of course, the last election, Boris Johnson was able to bang up his majority to 90 seats, in part because he was able to go after Labor being perhaps a little bit equivocal when it comes to the EU and returning to the market. But now the very man who argued against it was beaten by the country, returns now to take over the British perspective on global affairs.
Yeah, I mean, look, whatever you might say about David Cameron's term as Prime Minister, you'd have to say foreign policy wasn't his strong suit. I mean, Brexit has been an absolute disaster for Britain. And, of course, he didn't anticipate it was going to go that way, so he just politically fumbled it. And so what job have they gone and given him? The job of looking after foreign policy for Britain. So, I mean, these are end of days times for that Conservative government. They'll most certainly be voted out in the next election, and it probably can't come soon enough.
I mean, certainly we have no examples in this country of a former Prime Minister becoming the Foreign Minister after being removed. Oh, that's right. Shout out to the Washington...
Or a current Prime Minister misreading the room on a referendum. Striking.
All right.
As we know, as you know, Holly, we're very lucky in this country because we have two foreign ministers, one based in Canberra and another one based in Washington. So aren't we very lucky?
No. He said it. Well, I mean, he's really foreign minister, ad hoc prime minister,
How good's Nicholas going tonight?
Knowledge.
I'm loving Nicholas tonight.
I've got to get a sneaky look of you, Nick, because I can't see you. And I remember last year's Movember. So
it's a dirty
they're going to have to get a full stream of you.
It's as bad as ever. It's as bad as ever, Holly.
Nick.
All right.
Oh,
By the way, well done to
you better
Nicholas.
send me the link again to donate.
It's a shocker.
That's bad.
It's a shocker.
Good luck to him. But did you know he's raised $98,000 since all of this thing started? Just him on his own with the Mo. Well done, mate, and to everyone else involved. So apparently there is an underfunding of $1 billion to local councils to be able to fix potholes. Now, obviously, they're now demanding more money from state and federal government, but as you remember last week, we told you that, of course, there are 208,000 people who already work for local government. It costs $15.3 billion already. Perhaps, just perhaps, some of that money, Holly, could be redirected to fixing the damn potholes.
Well, you'd think so. And I mean, the fact that most general managers of even a rural council get paid more than the Prime Minister, we've probably got a bit of disparity in the salaries that are being paid in some of these local government areas. I'm a very big believer with local governments that they are rates, roads and rubbish. And certainly any of those councils who went and developed yes banners, which they put up everywhere across their municipalities, perhaps they could recycle some of them to fill in some of the potholes. Clover Moore could probably do the entire nation with the number of yes banners we had across Sydney City. Yeah. But seriously though, for rural and regional areas, I mean, people in the city, I was leaving Sky the other night driving towards the tunnel, and there was this massive pothole in the middle of the road going down to the Sydney Harbour Tunnel, which is bad enough. But if you're out in the bush, not only do you not tend to have gutters on the side, the roads just peel away and they become incredibly dangerous, particularly when you go into times of harvest. With big trucks and combines on the road. It's a serious issue for rural and regional Australia.
It absolutely is, and I'm sorry to make light of it, but still, that particular pothole you're talking about was when Rita Panahi accidentally dropped her wallet on the road, and it created quite a dent. So I apologise.
It is quite
My
the
Persian
pothole.
Princess, it is quite the pothole, and it's quite the portfolio, and it's all due to her investing.
Well, but there's another serious point to all of this. Beyond the fact that all the councils, like my own Inner West Council, which I suspect is right now trying to figure out a sister city relationship with Gaza, is they're pushing out all of these electric cars with their big, heavy batteries now, and so they can't maintain the roads now with normal, nice, road-friendly petrol cars, and now we're going to be having these big, heavy, road-killing electric vehicles with their massive, heavy, fire-catching batteries heading down the road. It's just going to be a disaster.
Nothing, James.
We'll see.
Exactly. Contribute nothing because
hang on,
the road costs are through petrol
30 seconds,
excise.
Nicholas. Super 30. I'm already very tight on time.
Okay, there's a serious point here which has been completely missed because you're all obsessed with the tired old trope of beating up on local government. Fact is, local government in Australia has to manage 700,000 kilometres of roadway, but only collects 4% of the nation's revenue. And what's going on? It's because state and federal governments love those big headline-grabbing mega projects and forget the basics of maintaining local roads. Here in Victoria, local government has a rates cap of 3.5%.
Come on, I've got to go.
Construction inflation is going up at 10%.
I spent all my time praising you about November, which means no time for this debate. Alas, I love you all. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you, gang. Talk again very soon. Quick break, back with more late debate about 4 from now. I talk too long, I stay too long. I'm sorry. See you tomorrow.